And I think there's not one answer, but again, to kind of Fran's example there, I think there's some stuff that you can do to be quite skilled in the feedback, which can't always guarantee the response you're going to get is going to be a really good one. I mean, I've had conversations with directors of children's services before where I've tried really hard to get it right, and it's just like, you know, it's not gone well. They've got loads of other stuff going on. In their mind, there might be a bit of, I'm okay, you're not okay, like I need to get on with this stuff right now. But again, you can come back to it. And it can be a kind of valuable experience to have another bit of feedback about. So there isn't one answer. I think the thing that's significant here, and you'll kind of notice this in the freedom and responsibility paper, is that if we can crack this ourselves as an organisation really authentically so that people are able to have and receive these conversations all the time, it is noticeable to other organisations that you're working with that type of organisation, and that in itself is a powerful statement of how we think we should work with each other, and I guess our role in the social work system in doing that as well.
I think it would be really useful to try and be really cohesive through, so participants working in this way with families and also CSWs with participants. And I think that the beginning of that conversation that needs to sort of, you know, we're going to have, what the goal is, have really transparent, honest relationships, so we can give this different kinds of feedback. Is that okay with you? Because, you know, families will give you plenty of feedback about how you are. But at the beginning, to sort of frame that in that that's what sort of the core belief is. I mean, I'm going to steal some of this for some of this.
Oh, we need to go away, yeah. I mean, look, it's a really important point, because we are asking people on our programmes to have far more difficult, challenging conversations of, you know, the hardest this conversation is going to get at frontline is a conversation about whether or not you're meeting expectations or not, to an extent, as to whether or not you should still be part of the team. Now that compares in no way to a conversation that a social worker might be having with a family about expectations around care for their child, where the implication could be much more serious. So if we're asking people on our programmes to have these conversations on a daily basis, it's so important that we are also able to kind of have them in a way that is frequent and becomes customary. Okay, that's the desk model. Let's move on to some ideas. How are we doing on time? So we're at 5 to 12. What time does this finish?
Half an hour left.
Okay, half an hour.
We're just going to do back and forth on these.
We're going to do back and forth quite quick, and then we'll sort of make some progress on this, and then hopefully have some time for more examples and working through how we might solve some stuff.
I think after this, the last time we did like a little break.
Yes, we did.
So I think we should do that again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who's going
You'll
first?
go first.
Okay. Try not to be afraid. This said something else when we first wrote it, and then
try not to be shy.
Don't be shy. It said don't be shy, and then someone was like, "That's not very helpful." So it now says try not to be afraid of giving feedback just because it's hard. The point here is the one I've literally just made, which is to be in line with our values and the expectations we have of each other in this organisation, and what it is that we're asking social workers to do with families. We need to hold ourselves to the same standards. So as hard as it is, it's part of your core job to meet this expectation that we all have of each other to have these conversations.
And the next one is around being too polite or being too blunt, because politeness...
Might speak up a little bit.
Okay. Politeness and being really nice can be just as damaging as being blunt, and it's not genuine, and it's not fair to do that to someone.
Yeah. There's another slide on like super advanced bits of giving feedback conversations, which are kind of like, they're called higher level skill bits. It builds on this point, which is around clarity, which comes up time and again, but the niceness and the politeness actually can just breed this disingenuousness. You know, if you want to be nice but you've got this disappointment and you're not sharing it, you'll end up sharing the disappointment with someone else. You'll end up talking about, oh, they did that, it was really annoying, and then that becomes a bigger thing, it becomes a bit bigger. It's just not it's not genuine or fair. So the politest, nicest thing you can do is say, I've got a disappointment, and here's what it is. And on the next one, in these conversations, you can sometimes get so into the space of thinking about what you want to say that you forget the conversation itself is part of a relationship. You're going to get data as well as give data. So people are going to tell you things about what was going on for them at that moment in time, or what they were thinking about, or what they were trying to do, or their intention, which will be helpful for you in that conversation. So just remember that in those discussions, listen as well as speak, and try and ask questions to understand what's going on and what was behind it.
I think the last point is quite important, just making it clear that you can have the conversation again. It's not just a one-off thing, you're just going to build up to having this feedback and then you're never going to discuss it again. Sometimes you might need to have a few conversations to get to a point where you understand what's needed.
I've had the 5-minute conversation, okay, it's done, don't need to talk about it ever again because I've had it really awkward.
So it's important for the feedback to be timely when you can. But then at the same time, if you have waited a long time to give the feedback, we would say still give the feedback even if it's a long time after, because it's better to have given it than not said anything at all.
Sometimes I've sat in sessions about feedback before where it's been, make sure it's timely, and then there's some sort of statement about it not being as useful if lots of time has passed. I've always thought that's a really unhelpful thing to say, because it almost gives you an excuse for not sharing something that's important to share. Even if I did something 12 months ago and it felt small, I would still rather you say it than not say it. I would have rather you said it closer to the time, but the worst thing is to not say it at all. Clarity. I've talked a bit about this, and I'm going to say more in a minute, but it really matters. Use examples, be precise with your language, and if you're a manager, be very clear about what you need to see change. I think sometimes, especially people who are new to management roles, can often hold this without holding appropriately the power in their management. And it's disingenuous not to do that, because you have some expectations, and part of your job in management is to make those really clear and communicate those. And if you're not being clear about that and what you need to see change, again, that's not fair. And I think people who are new to management, or even people who are very experienced with it, can often find it a bit harder to bring in that aspect of the conversation where it says, I'm going to need to see these things change. Because that feels way more serious. It kind of feels quite heavy, but that's important as well for clarity.
And it's also really important to prepare and think about what you want to say in the conversation, and speak to colleagues if you need to. I know I've done it. I know I've spoken to Amy a few times about giving feedback, and it's quite useful just to go through, these are the things I want to say, and then to even get some feedback in that conversation about, or maybe you shouldn't say those things that way, or maybe you can go down well if you said it that way. So it's a skill, so it's important to practice. Just take a little break now and then go to the next bit. Next bit is about responding.
Let's do a bit more and then
Okay.
have a conversation about responding.
So the next few slides are just around receiving and being open to feedback. Things that I think are really important to avoid is in your kind of immediate response, trying to justify why something might have happened, or over-explain it, or say, well, it happened because of this, and this is why, and then this happened. Sometimes it's quite important to just kind of listen and think about the feedback that you're receiving at the moment. The worst thing that can happen is someone just says, no, that didn't happen at all. It can happen. So I think it's really important to manage your own emotions and how you respond, both verbally and non-verbally. I know for myself, and I've said this before in previous discussions, I have to really think about my face and how I respond, because I'm quite expressive with my face, and people have told me that before, like raised eyebrows or kind of frowning. But it is important to think about that, so that they don't get put off from giving you the feedback. In the moment, I think it's really important to really try and listen to it. Sometimes if you're feeling like you don't agree with the feedback or you're not quite sure where it's coming from, it might be that you need to take some time to think about it and come back to the conversation, because you're not going to respond in the most appropriate way if that's how you're feeling. And I think what's really important, the last point, is just that to remember how you respond in that moment will affect how that person then comes back to you and gives you feedback in future. So just really think about, and it's hard to do in the moment, especially if you're responding in a way that's not, might not be appropriate to what's being said, but to really kind of control that a little bit and say, okay, maybe we need to come back to this and ask some more questions about what's being discussed.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything?
Well, just that I think the message from this session is about how you give feedback, but also taking lots of responsibility for how you respond to it. And the point that Andrea made there was that everything you do when you're being given feedback is communicating something to the person giving you feedback. And if what you're communicating is defensiveness or dismissiveness, that's not okay, because it has an effect on how well or easy it is for that person to come back and have another conversation again. It's not to say that you need to say everything they said was accurate or that they fully understood the picture. That's a different point. But it is really important that the way that you present and respond sets the tone and culture for this as much as the way the person has the conversation with you.
Can I just raise another point? Just again, interested to see what people think. The only one issue that sort of comes up in my mind is when giving feedback and sort of accepting it and being accepting of it suggests that the person giving feedback is always right. So
they may not be.
How do you manage that? Yeah, just interested. What do people think?
Yeah.
When I've experienced that, when I feel like the person hasn't been right, I don't think it's helpful to get into that conversation in that discussion, and that's why I think it's sometimes better to go away and come back to it, because then it can end up like a ping pong where you're like, you've said this, well actually no, and then you end up in a conversation that's not very productive. So sometimes it's better to say, okay, I've heard it, let's come back to it and think about why is it that I don't think this feedback is right, because it might be that there's something in it that's touched a nerve and it is right and you just haven't responded to it in a good way, or it's genuinely like this isn't based on fact and I need to come back to it.
I guess if you've done it the way that you described in terms of not saying you did this, but saying this was the effect it had on me, you can't be wrong in your feedback. Do you know what I mean? You're sort of saying this happened to me, so I think that would be much easier to sort of hear, even though it wouldn't be easy to hear. It would be just, you'd sort of then be disappointed in yourself for having that effect. But if it's sort of delivered in a way that's like, I'm not sure that you're aware of this, but this is the effect it had on me, and you're like, oh my god, I'm sorry, you know.
That's helpful, because you can be wrong about the intent, but
Of
not
course,
the effect.
so,
That's helpful.
It's also, feedback isn't like a pass the parcel, like, you know, like a hot potato going around a group. It's like, oh my god, like I've got to give it to you as quick as possible, and then you're like, oh, pass it on. It should be much more, you know, if you get to the point of that sort of realisation and conversation, well, you don't agree. If you're able to have that conversation and the relationship's good, that's a great moment to kind of make use of and have a really good conversation about. And almost just that, you know, that little discussion we had there about the distinction between intent and expectation. That is, I mean, if you are having those conversations with colleagues here, that is wonderful, and that's, you know, that's great progress. So it's not to say that you'll get into a conversation and they'll be linear or clear always. They might not be. There might be ones where I did something a few weeks ago where I was kind of brusque with someone in the office and a bit rude, and then someone said, Josh, you were rude in that moment, and I had an immediate emotional response which was, you know, you're absolutely right, and I'll apologise for it. So,
but did you feel that you was within that situation, or did you just say you're absolutely right because you thought that was just accepting the feedback?
They were absolutely right. I didn't respond appropriately. And look, so there's some of this which is about who we're working with, right? So this requires people to have a deep level of awareness about themselves and what they do, and a high level of responsibility. If you're having a conversation about feedback with someone who's not got the awareness or a high level of responsibility, then you are in a difficult position, because that makes it harder if they're not willing to take responsibility for stuff. They had an effect. I had an effect in that moment in how I responded to somebody, and it wasn't me at my best. And I kind of knew that when I did it. And then when the person said to me, that wasn't great, it's like, yeah, you're absolutely right. But I could feel myself getting defensive when they said it to me, right? Because that doesn't match with my story about who I am. I don't have a story inside my head which is that I'm rude. And so if someone says to me, I saw you and you were rude, you know, I've got a kind of almost animalistic response, which is, whoa, that's not, you know, I can always feel it building in your body, that's not who I am. And you might have had a similar thing where you told something sometime and it's so far from your own self-talk or self-image, even though it's quite a precise, specific bit of feedback, and the person was absolutely right, I still had a reaction. Now the trick, and it comes on to the higher level feedback bit in a moment, is to remember that, and I'll say more about this in a moment, that the most important times to manage your emotions are when it's hardest. Also true, the times when you most need to give feedback are when it's most difficult to do it. That's why this is a skillful endeavour. We can all sit here and academically agree that, all being well, having more conversations about mismet expectations and disappointments would be good. When the rubber hits the road and we're in that moment and we know we should respond in a certain way, but someone tells us something, there are, you know, biochemical reactions we have, and so there's sort of self-management piece to this, which really matters.
There's like a bit of that I wonder how much space there is for us always picking up things though as well, because I think it's really important that we also work in a place where there's like a lot of compassion and a lot of understanding, and you know, I think kind of I guess my view of someone giving you that feedback is maybe also, you know, if I heard you being rude or you were rude to me or you were just a bit short with me, I'd just be like, oh, Josh's probably having not a great day, like he's not normally like that. You know, there's a space where some of those things aren't necessarily always helpful because of the frame of mind that someone's in, or like, you know, other complicated issues. So it's interesting thinking about how this fits in with, you know, maybe people having kind of complications with their mental health. You know, if you're quite an anxious person, maybe this isn't always that helpful. So like how all of those things fit in, where we can still show a lot of understanding and kind of belief that people mean well and that people that we work with are good people, but also wanting to help people improve, but not pick up on every single small thing that people do wrong, because I don't think that's helpful either.
I guess to incorporate what you said though, like if you were going to give, you might give the feedback by waiting to the following day and saying, wow, I noticed that yesterday you weren't at your best.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
It could be a point about timing rather than whether or not
you
you
could think about how, you know, that you could be very clear that it surprised you because it was really different from how you normally. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Are you okay, Josh? Because you seemed quite different
exactly.
yesterday how you responded to me. So,
but that's not necessarily feedback
well,
though, is
no,
it? That's
well, after I've responded,
checking.
yeah. Well, I might say something and then you can say, well, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, and I think that they're different.
You can then give the feedback.
But they're different things though as well, because like, you know, and I think that we want to be a really like open and welcoming workplace, which does mean that if, you know, if people do feel like levels of anxiety, actually being picked up on everything is not necessarily that helpful, because they're already aware and they already overanalyze absolutely everything that they do anyway. So it's like trying to find a space where like there's also, you know, kind of that compassion is there, where it's like, oh, I just wanted to check that you're okay because I felt like maybe you weren't okay yesterday, rather than saying, Josh, can I speak to you? Like, I just wanted to.
Well,
do you think
but
it's
I
about the
think
relationships though? In terms of like, if you don't know, if you've just met that person and that's how they behave, you would have to give them the feedback, and in their response to you, they might then tell you and share a bit more information about actually this is how I'm feeling, and this is why I've responded in this way. Unless, do you know what I mean? Unless you have that relationship and you know that they're going through this in their life right now, and this is why they might be behaving a certain way.
I guess the flip side is that you risk
how
everyone
will you
sugarcoating. Like you risk like people just walking around being smiley even though they're not smiley.
No, that's what I mean. But if you don't know that bit of information about someone, how can you? You might almost have to give the feedback for them to respond in a way that tells you actually this is why, and then you know for future. Okay, when that person does this, it's because of this, and then my feedback will not be. Do you see what I mean? So you kind of have to. You can't not give it because they might.
Yeah, you have to get to know someone.
Exactly.
I think one of the things we're doing with the culture is we're saying people need to take extraordinary levels of responsibility for how they work as part of this team. And in that, the small things are absolutely up for moments of feedback and learning from. And I want everyone to be hungry to look for and take meaning from those moments. Not in a, constantly picking away at every little thing that's not been done well with the intent of finding fault, but doing it from the position of if these small things aren't talked about, they become bigger things and they become harder to talk about. And if I'm behaving in a way and I'm responding to people in a certain way, I absolutely need to know that.
I think
it's not okay, and I need to hear that. And I need everyone here to know. I need to hear that, and I need all of you to hear that. And you can get into a great conversation. I can be like, yeah, it was a really tough day yesterday. I'm sorry, I was sure I shouldn't have done that. But it has to be an expectation, disappointment conversation. I don't think we should avoid it.
I don't think we should avoid it either, but kind of touching on what you were saying about compassion, I think there's something in, if people do respond defensively, that's completely normal, and just having that bit of compassion and empathy towards it, rather than getting in a to and a fro, I realise this is a really difficult conversation, and actually you're trying really hard, so maybe we'll talk about this tomorrow, or just something in the sense of, instead of like us, you can't, we all try not to be defensive, but it's normal if you're trying, and we're all trying our best, just sort of keeping that back in mind, I guess.
It's a really good point. I mean, I've been in so many conversations, as is Andrea, where someone ends up in tears, many, and people don't realise in work like how many tears there end up being about stuff. There's lots, because of that very point. People try really hard, and at the moment where you're maybe not at your best is also when it's hardest, and when it's hardest to hear this stuff, and when it's hardest to have a conversation about it. So just to say sometimes, look, we start that conversation, now's not a good time, let's come back to it later on. It's absolutely, it's the smartest thing to do. One thing we're going to ask was just to give people a couple of minutes to share, maybe with the person next to them, just some reflections on this conversation so far about, from what you've heard so far, are you most likely to take away? What are you still pondering? Claudia and Katie, if you could do that together on the Skype, on mute as well, ideally, so that we got all hear it sort of publicly, and then maybe just do that conversation for a minute and a half, and then we'll come back.
Should we talk about?
I think that definitely
it really
difficult.
I think an interesting way to frame it is sometimes
I guess that's
how can we make sure this situation is so rather than being I don't know, I found that really you get the vibe.
When you're back, really history, this and this, the context, I think we need to face-to-face. And would you feel more comfortable if you was not in that?
It's weird because I've been able to contact them. I think they're got to they've got original picture. So I'm like, gauge
time.
And that's
Doesn't really it needs to be an individual question.
But
We
that's
don't
not
time
time
should
spent.
be.
I think
From
from
a
a
time
time
Yeah, people are, and you're like, do I mean it? That's so gushy. It's like but actually,
I think this is
when you start, and then when I also notice it, don't say it. Just say it. So I think actually, really trying to make it
like to be accept feedback, not immediate, but taking that time to think about it and do it. Like I wonder,
All right.
So I think there's something that's
Guys,
kind
sorry
of
to
take that really into
chuck through that in a minute. I wasn't actually counting, but it feels like 90 seconds. whatever 90 seconds feels like. I think those guys are on mute. Oh, you good? Okay, just in the final 10 minutes then, there's 4 things which, as Andrew and I were planning these sessions out, we wanted to describe some tips for having feedback conversations that we don't want to share with you in a kind of daunting sense of here's what we expect people to be doing straight away, but with practice these are some of the things that we've found, and I've definitely found with each of these points that makes it quite hard to learn to do this stuff, and it's worth airing that and sharing it now, not in a way to say this makes it really hard, don't do it, but this makes it really hard, and even I find it sometimes. I struggle with some of these points, and I'm still learning. So, the first point is one that I think I've already mentioned, which is that the better the relationship, the easier the feedback, but that's not always possible, especially if it's a new relationship or you're annoyed. So again, it's in that space of the better the relationship, the easier the feedback, but where you most need the feedback is where the relationship probably isn't best. And it's true with timing, it's true with the relationship, it's true with how you feel. So if you're feeling like it's not a good time to give the feedback, the relationship isn't good, and your response is really annoyed, you're probably in a space where you definitely need to have a conversation, even though it feels like all the things are going against you having a conversation. But that's one of the things that makes this hard. You kind of have to navigate through those models at the beginning about you being okay, them being okay or not, and the grievance barometer, if you like. Those are part of the navigation of having these conversations where they're sometimes hardest. Crystal clarity. I sent round a podcast link. I don't know if anyone. I know the feedback podcast, which I don't know. Did you have a listen to?
That whole series of podcasts is really good. I'd recommend listening to them.
Yeah, it's the workplace ones. Yeah, they're really excellent. They're on Teams, so I posted them on Teams if people want to have a look. And Juliet, what did you think?
It was interesting. I'm trying to think about it. I think the context you put it in was maybe slightly small in a way. Like I expected it to be daunting. So some of the themes that were there were just like, oh, that seems like quite jarring and quite like I think more forceful than the culture that we're trying to create, which is like more open, so we don't want this idea to be daunting. But in that in mind, I think it was really interesting.
No, absolutely. So it's got some really radical ideas in it, which I'm not advocating we adopt. But as a thought experiment, it's a really interesting thing to listen to. And essentially, there's this company where they've got sales targets or whatever the equivalent is at that organisation, and they rank everybody, and then they share it with everybody. And everyone's in the room, and then they basically, the guy, and you should listen to it because it's absolutely fascinating. And there's lots
his
of
response was amazing. If I could get into a space where that was my response, then
the
I would
lowest
be.
manager.
the lowest performing, although it almost sounded not believable. I still can't listen to it. I was like, I'm not sure if people respond.
What was his response?
Oh, it was like, I love that this is a powerful moment for me because I can learn from this in a way that I can't learn from anything else. So I want to learn from those other 198 people who score better than me, right? So now an amazing response, you kind of think, is that true? I would listen to the podcast because it's a really interesting podcast more widely. That's not the only example in it. But it does come to this point about crystal clarity. I'm not suggesting we do any of that here, but what we do need, and when I'm having coaching conversations with people in my team about conversations they want to have with people, often I'm sort of mentoring or encouraging people to be clearer than they would otherwise like to be. it often ends up being that that's the kind of direction I'm trying to encourage people to go into. Because in these conversations, you would not believe how unclear people are. Like, it is the biggest flaw in feedback conversations. And there's all sorts of different techniques we use. There's the sandwich, and they talk about this in the podcast, there's the like massive chunks of white bread with a tiny bit of ham in the middle, which is like, oh, that event that you did, I thought it was really good, like, it was great to have you there, and like, there were so many people, and it was great, yeah, excellent. There was this thing you did with the badges at the front, and maybe that could have been better, but overall I just thought the event was absolutely fantastic, and yeah, I'll see you later, bye. Right, so there's that. People do an awful lot of that. So it's okay to just have a conversation about, you don't need to bring in all the other positive things. If you are good in your relationships with each other at pointing out when things are going well, you don't need to always cover things, smother it in other meaning. Be really clear. Like, it's much more helpful.
I think the only reason why you do that is to make yourself feel better as well. It's never about the other
You're
person, which
absolutely right,
is the
Amy.
most important thing to
absolutely
hold, I think.
Yeah.
Is that you shouldn't
That's
do
a really
that
good
because
It's
scientifically
about you.
it's not as impactful. They don't hear the thing that you want to share with them.
They're already
yeah,
listening
yeah,
to
and
the bit that's the feedback.
Exactly.
And they're trying to find it in what you said.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's just to make you feel more comfortable with saying something negative. That's
Yeah.
the only reason why you do it.
Yeah, there's that. There's then, and the other bit of it is you recreate reality after the conversation. So you have the conversation, you're really stressed and you're worried about how you're saying things. You said it really quickly, you got it out, then you kind of scuttled around and moved on from it. And then you come out and you say to your partner when you get home, oh, I said this, and I told them this, and then your partner goes, oh, what did they say? And then you go, I didn't actually say that. Anyone done that? You come out of a meeting and you your self-talk is, I'm really glad I told them, like, I said this and it was really clear, and then you're like, I don't actually think I said that. I think I said it. I said 1/10 of that. People do that an awful lot as well. And so in clarity terms, like, just always risk being clearer. It's a much better thing to do, much fairer. I think it gets you into a space where meaning or intent can't be misconstrued so easily. And we've got a phrase for this in what we expect social workers to do, which is take relational risk with families, right? So you don't always know what the reaction is going to be, you need to judge it, but take relational risks with each other. You know, say, look, I don't know how you're going to respond to this, and maybe a bit worried about how you're going to respond to this, because I've thought a lot about what I'm going to say, but I want to be really clear, because I went to that feedback workshop, and one of the things I was told was to be really clear. I actually had a feedback conversation with somebody after the last feedback workshop. It was Katie Mond, and she'd asked me for some feedback about something after the workshop. It was unbelievably good, the conversation, because I was like, I've just run this workshop. I have to be I have to role model this stuff because I've just been spending an hour and a half talking about it. And she had to respond in a way which was like really. She had to ask lots of questions, understand it, not be defensive. It was such a good conversation. She got much more meaning out of it. She asked some great questions. I was much more free and confident in sort of being clear about stuff. It was really, really good. So the idea is to get many more conversations there, but clarity is a killer at feedback a lot of the time because we're so unclear with what we're saying. Managing your emotions. So I guess the other slides talk about paying attention to emotion. This point here is about managing your emotions. So when you spot or feel that you're having a reaction that's defensive or dismissive or getting upset or you're getting angry and giving feedback, pay attention to those things and adjust your action as a result of it. So don't just ignore it. And that might be to say, now's not a great time to have this conversation. And then take responsibility for saying, look, I want to have the conversation again, and sorry we had to cut it short, but that wasn't a good time for me to hear it, but I'm ready to hear it now. Just managing your emotions is really important. Sometimes in a conversation you can, someone might say something you might be giving the feedback and they might respond by saying some things which trigger you to think, I cannot believe they're bringing that up again. You got to think in the moment, how helpful is it going to be to take the conversation down that avenue or not? So all of that is about managing your emotion in the moment. And again, we're asking social workers to do this all the time, not only to ask a great question with a family, but then to, from what they hear, in the moment, think about what an appropriate, good, helpful response will be. And so we should do that with each other. And then the final one here is another sort of slightly paradoxical suggestion, which is to prepare but not be scripted. So you know, sometimes when I've felt like I've got really important conversations to have with people that I'm worried about, I'll over-script it. So I'll almost write out what I'm going to say, and then I feel like my objective in the conversation is to get it all out. And what I'm not doing is I'm not watching how the person's reacting. I'm not pausing and asking questions. My objective is just to kind of emit as much information at the person as possible. Where my feedback conversations have been most useful is when I've been able to kind of use what I'm seeing from the person or hearing to take the conversation in a different direction with them. And then you get into a whole different area of kind of meaning and understanding.
So people can often respond in a way that you weren't expecting, and then the conversation can actually be a better one because you've got some different information.
Absolutely. And that sometimes can be, I mean, it can be better in all sorts of ways. It can be that they tell you something you just didn't understand before. They might say, yeah, I've actually had this feedback before and I don't know what to do about it. And then you can kind of skip over a lot of the other stuff and go straight into how do we problem solve this. I've had conversations before about people's body language and communication where, as I'm telling them, they are giving me body language and communication which is the content of the feedback. So I've been able to say, and you are doing it right now, which is the most powerful feedback because it's immediate, it's in the moment. They can respond, definitely, but this is what we're talking about. You know, if I'm having this conversation with you now and we're finding this hard, think about how everyone else is going to find this conversation if they're having it with you. So those moments, if you're too scripted, you can't make use of those moments. You can't use them.
What I will always do is think of maybe like 3 or 4 things that I want the person to hear when I've left the conversation, and have those things in mind, but not have this is how I'm going to say it, this is where I'm going to say it, I'm going to say this bit at the beginning. You just have those things in mind, and then that helps you to have a productive conversation.
Yeah. There's actually a couple of staff from here a few years ago went to a session by a tennis coach on how he coaches tennis players, world-class tennis players. It's an absolutely amazing session, and so many parallels between sports coaching and professional workplace coaching. But one of the things he said was, it's the sort of parallel with scripting, is you go through the model of playing a match, a tennis match, and you're imagining where the person's going to be, where the exchange is going to go, and where you're going to end up on the pitch. And you study really closely your opponent, and you kind of anticipate their moves. And if you do that too much, you lose any sense of being present in the game. And so and this is some of the inner game theory stuff. I don't know if you've read much on this, but in sports coaching, inner game, it's like how you manage yourself in the moment. For skiing, if anyone's been skiing or played tennis or any of these things where there's a sort of, you have this inner talk, and you can almost handicap yourself by not being really present in the right way. And I think the same is true with these sorts of conversations.
Can I just say, I think all of the giving feedback is important. I think seeking feedback is just as important. And I feel like, especially with manager, I don't think sometimes coordinators naturally just don't feel comfortable giving feedback. So I think a manager's responsibility also is to ask a coordinator or an officer, what can I do?
Yeah. So there's a comment there, Claudia and Katie, I don't know if you could hear that, but there's a comment about seeking feedback, and I think it's a really good point, because if you've been given an invitation to give feedback, that just makes the whole thing way easier. Shouldn't rely on it, but absolutely it can make it an awful lot easier. Yeah, we're out of time. I don't know if anyone's got any other comments or questions. Clive and Katie, was there anything you finally wanted to say at the end?
No, it's been really useful.
Okay, good. All right then. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
If you've got any, Andrea's got the slides.
Yeah, I'll send them round.
Send them around again. I'm going to send the freedom and responsibility paper out at the end of the day, and one of the sections in it is about feedback. So hopefully you'll read some parallels in there from this session. And if you've got any questions or you want any help about this, bear in mind that I think now we've probably got over 60 colleagues in the organisation who've been through the workshop. Many more will be going through it. So the majority of the people you're working with have been in this session for an hour and a half. So you can take, I would suggest, more risks in some of the conversations you might not otherwise have. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.